Today I'm talking with Bibhu Dev Misra about his new book, The Yuga Shift. And the theme of the book is investigating the themes of the Kali Yuga, but also the timing of it. And you present a very interesting thesis that redates the typical way that people look at the Yuga, the Kali Yuga in Hindu philosophy and when it starts and when it ends. And so we're going to get into that. And I just want to say this is actually an ideal time for me to be having this discussion with you because I am just doing my last edit of a new book manuscript, and it's on the topic of the origin and evolution of American empire. And a lot of it goes into the current moment where it looks like things in the world, particularly this empire, are going through a phase change, and we're on a route to a shift into global government. And one of the themes I talk about in the book is the themes of the Kali Yuga are playing themselves out through the story of American empire. But in my reading, and one thing we share in common is that we're both looking at this idea of the Dark Age, the Kali Yuga, as having an ending that's imminent, that we're playing, that this situation that we're seeing in the world where large fundamental transformations are taking place, that these are coinciding with a long prophesized ending of a dark age period. And so there's an alignment between these prophecies and the archetypes involved with them and what we're seeing play out in the world. And so for me, this is a theme I revisit a lot in the book. But I definitely want to go into your kind of revisionist analysis of the dating of the Kali Yuga because it's an original take, and I think it's really fascinating. So before we get into that, I don't know much about you. Would you be able to just offer a little bit of an introduction about yourself and what drew you to this topic in the first place?
Yeah, my profession, I'm an engineer and an MBA, and I worked as a technology consultant for nearly 2 decades. But it was while I was working as a consultant that I got interested in the ancient civilizations and the ancient mysteries. I read a few books written by Graham Hancock, and then obviously the usual Eric von Daniken and stuff like that. And then I started traveling to a few places myself. And being from India, I could always notice a lot of connections in terms of symbols and legends across the world, wherever I went, whether it was Egypt or Mexico, some other place. There were always some connections which were coming up. So that was the primary focus of my interest in the initial days. But then there was this excitement about the Mayan calendar ending in 2012. And that was the time I started thinking about the Yuga cycle of India and what is the possible ending date of the Kali Yuga. And then I came across so many different versions of the Yuga cycle, one which ran into millions of years, which never really made sense to me. But then I came across Sri Yukteswar's redating of the Yuga cycle, which was pretty attractive and it made a lot of sense. But there was one point which I did not agree on, and that was maybe not one, maybe 2 points which I did not agree on. Because as per the framework that Yukteswar presented, which had an ascending cycle of consciousness followed by a descending cycle of consciousness, adding up to a 24,000-year Yuga cycle, which is very close to the precession cycle. But as per his timeline, the Kali Yuga had already ended in 1699 AD. And after a period of transition, by the early 20th century, we were already in the ascending Dwapara Yuga or the Bronze Age. And that never really made sense because throughout the last 200 or 300 years, even though we have made a lot of technical and scientific progress, the level of consciousness has continued to deplete. And we have basically technological progress has pushed us into greater degrees of greed and selfishness and violence and divisions. So from and Kali Yuga is all about consciousness and our adherence to dharmic living. And from that standpoint, it never really made sense to me that the Kali Yuga is already over. You could just look out of a window and see Kali Yuga all around you.
Right.
That was the first. That was the first disconnect that I had with that model. The second one is after every yuga is over, and every tradition agrees on that, that there is a customary period of cleansing which happens, and the new yuga is going to start only after that period of cleansing and realignment is over. And nothing like that happened after 1699 AD. We just carried on with in a linear manner with the progress that was happening or the devolution that was happening. So I felt that it was necessary to take a deeper look into it. And I decided that I have to look at not only the Indian tradition, but across all the traditions that talk about this cyclical framework, because there has been a lot of distortions over the Kali Yuga itself. Texts have been lost, they have been distorted, changed, forgotten. And I thought that if I look at a number of different traditions, find the points where they intersect and overlap, find the kind of common threads, then it'll be easier for me to visualize what this original cycle might have looked like. And
Hmm.
so that was what got me interested. And in 2012, I wrote an article on the Kali Yuga and the Yuga Shift, where I proposed a different framework. And I said that the Kali Yuga ends in 2025. So that was like another 13 years in the distance. Nothing to worry about at that point. But now that we're in 2024 and the Kali Yuga ends exactly next year, so this is something which is of more urgency right now.
Right. And you got that article published on Graham Hancock's website, right?
Yeah, and it was very popular. It was translated into some 7, 8 languages, and then I lost count. So that
Wow.
article was very popular, and then I received a lot of messages from people all around the world. And we had so many email conversations. I had interactions on my blog, and then I started finding a lot of missing pieces. I mean, that article was a small one, not small. It was a medium-sized article, and so much more information came up, so I could plug in some of the other missing pieces of the puzzle, some of the unanswered questions. And so then I thought that a book is necessary, and I came out with the book last year in December.
Hmm. So it was about 10 years in progress, right? The timeline of when the first article came out versus when the book.
Yeah, it's not as if I was working the entire 10 years on that book,
Right.
because initially I thought that I have said whatever I had to say. But then maybe after another 3, 4 years, more information started coming in. And it was probably in 2018 or 19 that I decided to write the book.
Hmm. Well, let's start with this. There's seems to be a bit of or not a bit, but quite a fundamental amounts of controversy within Hindu philosophy and within the scholars in that field about how you date the Kali Yuga. And obviously, that's the thesis of your book, but let's just start off with the difference between estimates of it being like 400,000 years, 425,000 years versus what I've come across, which seems more reasonable estimation, which is around 5,000 years. When you were delving into it, how did you navigate the different conflicting estimates about this time frame and about how the mathematics works out?
Well, the first thing is that the Yuga cycle that runs into millions of years, around 4 million years, that was a distortion. It was very clear to me, because what they did was the Yuga half cycle is of 12,000 years. And that is specifically mentioned in texts like the Mahabharata or the Laws of Manu,
Hmm.
that the Yuga half cycle is 12,000 years. But in some of the other texts, like the Puranas, that was multiplied by 360, because some people said that every year in this 12,000 year half cycle is a year of the gods. And since the year of the gods is equivalent to 360 human years, you need to multiply it by 360. So the Yuga cycle suddenly becomes equal to some 4,032,000 years. And it was very clear to me this must have happened later, because this doesn't even tie up with the traditions of other cultures. And that is the point that I brought up earlier, that I decided to take a look across traditions, because there can only be a Yuga cycle for the entire world. You can't have a Yuga cycle that is specific for India, another one that's specific for Persia, another one that's for
Right.
Greece, one for Hopi. There's one across the world, and the data has been distorted. So we need to look across traditions. And then when I looked at Persia, and Persia is a neighbor of the Indus Valley, Persians have a Yuga cycle of exactly 12,000 years, and they divide it up into 4 yugas of 3,000 years each. Very simple and straightforward. If you look at the Greeks, they have two different values. There's a value of 10,800 years, which was proposed by Heraclitus of Ephesus. And there's another value of 12,952 years, I think, which was proposed by Cicero.
Hmm.
So these are the two main values, both of which are close to around the 12,000 year mark. And I'll talk about why there's a variation. And So, and when we look at the other predictions like the Hopi, they don't have a specific number for their cycle, but they say that they're currently living in the fourth world, and the fourth world is very close to its ending, although they're not able to put a specific date on the ending time. So all of this made me, it was pretty clear from this that the Yuga half cycle must be around 12,000 years, give or take a few hundred years this side or that side. And then when I came across Yukteswar's framework, where he said that there's an ascending cycle and a descending cycle, which adds up to 24,000 years, that seemed like a very attractive proposition because then it becomes very close to the precession cycle of the
Hmm.
Earth, which is 25,800 years. And since every time cycle that we have in nature, whether it's the cycle of day and night or the cycle of seasons, it's all based on astronomy. There's a
Right.
astronomical phenomena which is going on, which is driving the cycle. So there must be some astronomical phenomena which is driving the Yuga cycle, and it seems most logical that it should be the precession cycle because Cicero's value of 12,950 years, if you multiply it by two, you end up with a value that is, I think, 25,900 years. 25,920 years. And the precession duration is 25,800 years. So it's just 120 years difference. That means that Cicero was also talking about the precession cycle. He was talking of the half cycle of the precessional year. So I decided that I need to let that millennial cycle go. It makes no sense in the context of other traditions. It doesn't even make sense in the context of India because, as I mentioned, there are a couple of texts, important texts, Mahabharata and the Laws of Money, which has a 12,000 year cycle. So a 12,000 year cycle might have been distorted to a millennial cycle, but the other way around is very unlikely.
Right. And it's not particularly helpful to just conclude that we have 400,000 years ahead of us of a dark age. I agree with your point that all these philosophical traditions, particularly when we're talking about estimates of time cycles in different ages, should be grounded, or it would make sense that they would be grounded in some objective phenomena, of which astrology or astronomy would be the logical home for that. And in particular, we talk about the precession. For anybody who doesn't know, that's marked by the oscillating north celestial pole of the planet and the cycle that it makes it is interesting. The precession cycle of around 25,000 years actually marks the time that one cycle of motion of the North Celestial Pole along this kind of like zodiac, not the main zodiac that we think of, but there's a different zodiac for that North precessional pole that it moves around these constellations and these fixed stars, and that period of time marks the time of Plato's great year. And so in your work, that you're grounding your analysis in that same exact precessional cycle. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Because uh, a precession cycle is not only just the change of the North Pole over 25,800 year cycle. It's also the movement of the spring equinox point. So right now the spring equinox is in Pisces, but in a few hundred years the spring equinox sun will be located in Aquarius.
Hmm.
And in that manner, the position of the sun during the spring equinox will move backwards along the zodiac. We'll move from Pisces to Aquarius to Capricorn and like that. And it spends around 2,150 years in each zodiac. So it
Right.
adds up to a total cycle of around 25,800 years. That's why at each of these time periods that the spring equinox sun spends in a specific constellation is called an astrological age. So
Hmm.
right now we are in the so-called age of Pisces because which the sun has been, the spring equinox sun
Right.
particularly, has been in Pisces for the last 2000 odd years. And it's about to come out of that and get into Aquarius. And it'll stay in Aquarius for another 2100 years odd. And
Hmm.
that way it completes a circuit around the zodiac in 25,800 years approximately.
Right. Is there an equivalent alignment in your research with in the Hindu system with the idea of the zodiacal ages?
No, there isn't any specific mention of the zodiacal ages. We don't have that. What we do know is the position of the North Pole, of the pole star.
Hmm.
was different in a different time period. For instance, we know that at around 2900, 3000 BCE, our pole star was Thuban in Draco, and we refer to that pole star as Dhruva. And so we know that the pole star has moved,
Hmm.
but we haven't really mapped the Yuga cycle to the astrological ages. But my finding has been that the descending cycle is from Leo to Pisces, and the ascending cycle is from Aquarius up to I think Virgo.
Okay. So the move into the age of Aquarius represents a the upward swing of going from basically the age of iron up to the age of bronze and then silver and then finally gold.
Yeah, yeah. So from Aquarius, we start moving upwards. Uh, we move up the ascending cycle curve, and that curve, the next golden age will basically end when the age of Virgo ends and the age of Leo begins.
Hmm. Yeah, fitting. I wish I had dug up this before the chat, but I had about a year ago, a little over a year ago, I had a guest on who's a great scholar of Francis Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon. He's an English guy. His name's Peter Dawkins, but he also is a scholar of the mysteries, and he has a piece dating the where he kind of investigates the cycle of the North Celestial Pole, and he marks the current period as us being at the exact lowest point in this cycle. I think he marks it like in relation to the galactic center. I can't remember how exactly it is. I'll need to revisit that. But it's another piece of evidence that's aligning with what you're saying about this 2025 AD in period for the Kali Yuga, where it's like we're now at the bottom, we're now at a critical point in which it seems to me like the karma of the past 5,000 years or 7,000 years or however you want to date this period seems to be like concentrating and expressing itself out almost in the book. I almost describe it as like a grand finale of this age that we've been in. And so we're on the cusp of transformation and all the promise that that transformation can bring about. But it's like we have to go through this very intense period. And there are these signposts, whether it's his work dating this kind of position of uh, the zodiac as being the opposite or the lowest point away from the galactic center, and your work. There's a lot to suggest that there's an archetypal element to what we're experiencing today, and that there is a larger cosmic pattern playing itself out.
Yeah, definitely. And it's the cycles are real. I mean, if you look at the scientific data, the cycles are real because what the Yuga cycle doctrine tells us, when I say Yuga cycle doctrine, I basically mean the doctrines of every ancient culture which believed in this cyclical framework. So
Right.
what the Yuga cycle doctrine of all ancient cultures tell us is that when you are on the descending arc, you become smaller physically. You lose your energy, you lose your intelligence, your memory. And
Hmm.
that is now all coming out in the fore because it turns out that in the last 12,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, humans on an average have shrunk by 10% in size.
Mm.
And this comes to us from the entire Eastern Mediterranean region as well as Northern Europe. 10% in size, and this is an underestimation because very often they come across anomalously large skeletons which they toss out because they don't want people to start thinking about giants. So this 10% is an underestimation. It's probably close to 15 or 20% we've
Hmm.
lost in our physical size. And along with that, our bone density, our bone strength, our muscular strength has also declined. Recently, there was an article published by, I think, the Cambridge University, which says that an average farmer who lived at around 5000 BCE would have easily outrun a highly trained modern day athlete. That kind of gives you an idea of the level of their physical strength and their bone strength.
Hmm.
When an average farmer, he leaves his plow and he starts running and he maybe outruns the fastest runner today. I don't know who he is today. So that's the kind of decline in our physical size. The most interesting thing is the decline in our cranial capacity. Now, we know that our cranial volume is an indicator of our intelligence. It's an indicator of our intelligence, both our IQ and our EQ, as well as our memory. And it turns out in the last 12,000 years, again, since the end of the last ice age, our cranial capacity has declined by 10% in case of humans and 7% in case of women.
Mm.
10% case of men and 7% case of women. And this data has been compiled on the basis of some 10,000 cranial specimens that they have found for the Holocene period. This is not some small sized data sample. 10,000 cranial specimens in the Holocene period tell us the exact same thing, that our cranial volume has shrunk by at least 10 to 17%. And if we are living in a higher age or a higher cycle, or if we are at the pinnacle of civilization, then how come we have lost so much cranial capacity? And evolutionists don't have any answer for it, because all along they have been arguing that the reason why we evolved from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens was because of the increase in cranial capacity. And apparently, we had gained around 10% in our cranial capacity from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. And it was because of that we invented fire and agriculture and
Mhm.
sailing and all of those other things. But it turns out in the last 12,000 years, we have lost exactly the same amount of cranial capacity that we supposedly gained in 2 million years of evolution. So how does that happen? And they don't have an answer. You will never find this in public, in any mainstream media. There's only one article that I found in the Discovery magazine, which goes into the details of this phenomena. And this lady, she's a science writer. She goes around asking the paleontologists and the anthropologists to explain it, and they're all confused. They don't know what's going on. Well, what might be going on is that human cranial capacity never really increased in a linear manner over 2 million years. It has always been going up and down in tandem with the precession cycle. The same about our physical size. It has probably always been going up and down, which is why we see this decline over the last 12,000 odd years. And in case of cranial capacity, I also, in my book, I have pointed out that if you look at the cranial capacity of the Cro-Magnon who lived in Europe between 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, their cranial capacity was enormous. It was around 1600 cc, which is comparable to the cranial capacity of people who lived in the last golden age at around, let's say, 12,000 to 13,000 BC.
Mhm.
And that's because they lived at the peak of the previous golden age. Because if you add, if the peak of the last golden age was around 12,000 years, if we add another 13,000 years to 25,000 years to that, you reach 37,000 years ago. And the Cro-Magnon cranial specimens straddle that peak, which is why they had so high cranial capacities. And so the cyclical framework explains why the Cro-Magnon had such high cranial capacities, but the linear framework cannot, because as
Mhm.
per the linear framework, we evolved gradually over 2 million years. So the data that is now, yeah, and there's more. Over the last 12,000 years, food scarcity has increased. The skeletons that they found dating back to the Ice Age, they show no signs of malnourishment, but the malnourishment only increased in the later ages, later time periods. Similarly, there was no violence. They didn't find any sign of warfare in the Paleolithic skeletons. But it's only when we reach around 3,000, 5,000 BC, that's when the violence, a lot of skeletons are fractured or bones are fractured. So the violence, evidence of violence comes up. There were no diseases. They didn't find any diseases in the Paleolithic skeletons, the late Paleolithic skeletons
Mm.
dating to around 12,000. But diseases start coming up in the later time periods. So everything that the ancients told us about these cycles is now been validated by the scientific findings. The decline in our physical size, the decline in our cranial capacity, which means a decline in our memory and intelligence, and also the subtle abilities like intuition, clairvoyance, which people in telepathy, which people in the higher ages supposedly possessed. The decline in our environment, because of which we have more diseases. The change in our nature, we have become more violent and warring. All of that is reflected in the data. So, from my perspective, the cyclical framework is the real framework, because the data supports the cyclical framework. The data does not support the linear framework.
Right. Another thing that kind of makes this situation a little more complicated for us to imagine that there may have been features in the deep past that suggest a higher form of human functioning is that we have this sort of modern pseudoscientific mythology that has been just taught to us in our textbooks and reinforced in the media which is that, before a few thousand years ago, we were strictly hunter-gatherers and lived in small tribal units. And while that did exist, and maybe even for the majority of people that was the case, you know, you mentioned Graham Hancock earlier, there's clear evidence that there were high advanced forms of civilization in various waves that existed going back almost to a point where we can't even track it anymore. Certainly tens of thousands of years at least. And so one of the challenges for us as we go back and try to look at these cycles of thousands of years is that we don't have access to the full data set of what actually the extent of human civilization was, 7,000 years, 5,000 years, 12,000 years. For example, when we look at Egypt or China, the further back we go, the more advanced the artwork seems. And there definitely was high civilization and high culture within various key power points on the earth. And and so that's, this is one of the great transformations that we are approaching as we're moving through this critical time period is a complete reimagining of our own history as a species and what our own potentials actually are.
Yeah, that's right. And the reason why they find a lot of these remains in caves is because that's not washed away by floods.
Right.
And every archaeologist knows that caves are the places they go looking for skeletons and artifacts because they're not washed away by rain and flood, unlike something that is built out in the open. That doesn't mean that everybody in the time period lived in caves. Even today, if our civilization is destroyed, the archaeologists of the future will go looking in caves to figure out what kind of civilization existed in the Kali Yuga. And that wouldn't paint a very correct picture of our civilization.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first point. And the second point is we don't find this evidence of the high cultures is because of these periodic cataclysms that happen at the end of a yuga.
Right.
And we are now finding evidence of these periodic cataclysms across the world. All the Bronze Age civilizations, for instance, collapsed in a heap between 1100 and 800 BCE. That's the late Bronze Age collapse. All across the Eastern Mediterranean region, all the cities, they went up in flames. And it's not just the Eastern Mediterranean. The Indus Valley collapsed. In Mesoamerica, there were major changes. Wherever we have data, we find that there was a major collapse of civilizations at the end of the Bronze Age. And those cultures completely vanished. We just find the bricks and stuff. What happened to them? We don't know. And then we had these Iron Age cultures coming up at around 700 BC everywhere. So this kind of destruction of older cultures happens on a periodic basis, which is what the Yuga cycle says, that there's a periodic cleansing. And now we are finding that this has indeed been going on. For instance, if you look at the Bronze Age cultures, they all started at around 3,500 odd BC. Mesopotamia dynastic period starts at 3,500 BC. Egypt, the pre-dynastic period actually starts at around 3,500 BC, and the dynastic period starts later. But the pre-dynastic culture, which is known as the Gursian culture, they laid the foundations of dynastic Egypt. In India, the Indus Valley goes back to around 3,400 BC. And all of these Bronze Age cultures replaced the Neolithic societies that existed before. That was the time that sometime between 4,000 and 3,500 BC, that was the time the Neolithic cultures were kind of erased and the Bronze Age cultures came up. And that was the time that the Sahara also turned into a desert. So major environmental changes take place. There's a major replacement of older cultures by newer cultures, and that happens periodically. And if you look at the periodicity, it's roughly around 3,000 years, because the Iron Age cultures started coming up at around 700 BC or 600, 700 BC. The Bronze Age culture started appearing at around 3,500 odd BC. So that's a 3,000 year gap. And then at around 600 BC or 6,500 BC, there was a wave of new civilizations in Europe and Anatolia, but we don't have much data for other areas of the world. And then if you go back another 3,000 years, that's 9,600 BC. That's when Göbekli Tepe came up. And now it turns out that Göbekli Tepe is not the only example. There are a lot of other settlements in that same area which date back to around 9,600 BC, which means that there must have been other cultures coming up in other parts of the world at around the same time after the Ice Age ended. It's just that it's so difficult to find evidence of those other cultures because Göbekli Tepe was found by accident. It was Just nobody was looking for a 9,600-year-old culture. It just happened by accident. So thing is that every 3,000 years we do see a new wave of civilizations coming up, and which basically rises on the ashes of the previous civilizations that existed. So even from that standpoint, we can see that pattern. When you look at the pattern, it becomes very clear that every 3,000 years you're getting some form of new civilizations across the world.
Right. And for anybody listening, if you go to bibhudevmisra.com, you have some articles listed where you kind of go over your thesis, and there is a helpful map of your dating of the Kali Yuga cycle. And so, as you were just discussing, these key phases of civilization, kind of death and emergence, these are aligning with these key PowerPoints that you have featured in this chart. At the very top of this chart, it says Cataclysmos 1,200 years. What does that indicate? This is at the very apex of the chart. And then from there, it goes gradually from the Treta Yuga to the Dwapara to the Kali. And then the Kali actually expresses itself twice. There's a downward motion of the Kali, and then there's a upward, I think. So we'll go into that. But let's start at the very arch of this cycle, which is from 10,870 BC to 9,676 BC. You have this period of 1,200 years called Cataclysmos, and then opposite that, there's something called it sounds like this is Greek, Ekipiros. Can you explain these two periods here, and then we'll go into the dating.
Right. So initially, when I had written that article in 2012, I had used Sri Yukteswar's framework of 24,000 year cycle. But one of the questions that kept on bothering me is that why do I find a difference between the 24,000 year cycle and the 25,800 year precession cycle? The value of precession cycle is approximately 25,000. NASA generally rounds it off to 25,800 years, although it's slightly less right now. It's if you want to get specific, it's 25,776 years, but the value keeps on fluctuating. So 25,800 years is the rounded value. So I was curious, why do I have this difference of 1,800 years between these two cycles? They should ideally be same. And as I mentioned, Cicero's value indicates that the Yuga cycle and the precession cycle should also be same. Then I came across a piece of information in the Greek text, which I had missed earlier. So what the Greek says that at the end of the Golden Age, there is an extended period of transition, which is called cataclysmos. Cataclysmos means deluge. So this is the time when the world is destroyed by ice and water. And they also refer to it as the great winter of the great year. And then they also say that at the exact opposite point of that, there is another extended period of transition, which they call ekpyresis. The term ekpyresis means burning or conflagration. So this is the time that the world is destroyed and renewed by fire. And they also refer to this time period as the great summer of the great year. Yeah, so I was thinking that Cataclysmos is supposed to be the great winter, and we did go through a great winter. It's called the Younger Dryas period. Right. Younger Dryas period extends from roughly 10,900 BC to 9,700 BC for around 1,200 years. That was the time that global temperatures plummeted by around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius all over the world. And the glaciers started advancing to their ice age positions. So it was intense. It was an intensely cold period. And now it turns out that there was a devastating comet impact that took place at the Younger Dryas boundary, which is now called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And this comet, which broke up in multiple fragments, struck the Younger Dryas boundary, and it killed off all the ice age megafauna. And it started the Younger Dryas cooling by stopping the North Atlantic ocean current. And this continued for 1,200. The Younger Dryas period continued for 1,200 years. And the Ice Age and the Younger Dryas period ended exactly in 9,703 BC. This has now been dated by ice core samples from Greenland. So it was a 1,200 period of intense cold. And I thought, well, that lines up with Cataclysmos, because Cataclysmos is said to be the great winter of the great year. And we did go through a great winter of 1,200 years. Now, if Cataclysmos is of 1,200 years, then Epirus, which is at the opposite side, should also be 1200 years when
Hmm.
the world is renewed by fire. And then instead of the 300-year transitions, if we have these 1200-year transitions, then the duration of the Yuga cycle becomes exactly equals to 25,800 years, which is what I was looking for, some kind of a mapping between the Yuga cycle duration and the precession cycle. And it turned out to be an exact match that the 25,800 year Yuga cycle is an exact match with the 25,800 year precession cycle.
Hmm.
Once I include the periods of cataclysms and ecpiracies in the chart.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's evidence that there was two common impacts, right? One around 10,800 BC, and then the other one being the famous one at 9,700 that Plato
There,
discusses.
there, there were probably a lot more, but yeah, those two were the most important ones.
Right. So that set up, if I'm understanding right, the first one basically set up the conditions of this period of time we consider it's called the Younger Dryas. It's like the ice age where ice caps covered most of North America and everything like that. During this 1200-year period, is this the period of time when the sea levels would have been so much lower, like Graham Hancock talks about and shows in his documentaries?
Well,
Impact.
the last ice age started to end at around 20,000 BCE, and since then the sea levels were gradually going up. So by the time you reached around 10,000, 9 or 11,000 BCE, the sea levels had already increased by a fair amount,
Okay.
maybe half of the present of the total increase. But then suddenly the younger rise kicked in, and the sea level rise kind of flattened out. And then after the Younger Dryas ended and the Ice Age came to a complete end, that's when again there was uh, a very steep increase in sea level rise. And that continued throughout the Holocene period. And it's around, I think, 3,500 or 4,000 BC that we attained the current levels that we see, sea level.
Hmm.
So it was a gradual increase throughout the Holocene period, with a major increase at the end of the Ice Age, and another major increase at around 6,700 BC when the Laurentide ice sheet in North America collapsed, and the glacial waters which were trapped behind that ice sheet, it kind of rushed into the oceans and raised sea levels significantly in a short period of time. So that's called the meltwater pulse 3, and the one at the end of the ice age is called meltwater pulse 2, and there was another one at 14,000 BC that's called the meltwater pulse 1. These are the
Okay.
three sudden episodes of rise apart from a overall gradual increase.
Right. Is Graham Hancock, is his work on this like like your primary reference point as far as ice ages go and the comet impacts?
Yeah, his work is very informative, and yeah, I definitely rely a lot on his books. Uh, as far as this particular book is concerned, I found a lot of relevant information in his book Underworld, which he wrote a long time back, at around maybe 20 years ago. And
Mhm.
then there's another new book that he had out in 2015 called The Magicians of the Gods,
Mhm.
which also had a lot of interesting information. So those two books were very good reference points for me. But apart from that, while writing the book, I always tried to go back and read the source journals
Mhm.
and the source texts. Using his book as the main reference point, I always go back and read the source journals and the texts and refer to those journals just to make sure that I'm not writing anything which is not backed up by actual data or facts.
Right. So it's pretty like just following his work, it's pretty and others as well. It's pretty conclusive that there was high civilization going back to 10,000, 12,000, 13,000. And again, one of the challenges is that civilization keeps building itself. Oh, it keeps getting created and destroyed, but then when it builds itself very often atop the old foundations. But he also does a great job of illustrating how during these different periods when the sea levels were different, that there may have been great cultural centers that emerge in places that are now submerged underwater. And so our ability to and quite frankly, there does also seem to be some deliberate like concealment of information about what early civilization may have looked like. So you put all these together, it's very hard for us to imagine what a sort of a high civilization, or may have looked like around 13,000 BC, but there is almost conclusive evidence at this point that there something did exist back then, and also when we're considering how the difference between a low state of civilization and a high state of civilization, it's not just we're not just talking about material prosperity like we have in abundance today. It's more about like the state of consciousness of man and the harmony of society and things like that. Is that kind of also how you look at things?
Yeah, and it's very difficult to find archaeological evidence once you have the scale of destruction that happened during the Younger Dryas period. That basically wiped the planet clean, and with such major flooding events, comet impacts that took place throughout the Younger Dryas, it's extremely difficult to find archaeological remains of any civilization that existed in the Golden Age. But if you look at Göbekli Tepe, which emerged at 9600 BCE, they were using these megalithic stone blocks weighing up to 20 tons, hauling them on top of a hill and building these monuments. So obviously they knew about architecture, and if they could do that at such an early date, which
Hmm.
means that this must be the legacy of certain skills that have been brought forward from the previous high civilization that existed. That gives you an indication that yes, megalithic blocks would have been a feature of civilization that existed prior to the Younger Dryas period.
Hmm.
And we now find so much evidence coming up. Recently, they found that around 30,000 years ago, the people in Indonesia, they performed a leg amputation with absolute precision. And this leg amputation has actually healed, which means they also had the medicines to ensure that did not catch an infection after the
Hmm.
amputation was done. And this is a skill that we completely forgot over time. And even in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, there was doing a surgery in a hospital was a nightmare because 90% of people died because of the infections that occurred after the operation was done. It's
Right.
only after antibiotics were discovered in the 20th century that the operations were carried out successfully. So that kind of gives you an idea that if we can do a complex surgery 30,000 years ago, that means we did have medical skills. We did have knowledge of anatomy and medicine. And now they're finding that they found these flutes made of bones, which date back around 40,000 years.
Hmm.
And you can actually play those flutes, but they survive since they're made of bones. But anything made of wood wouldn't have survived. And they
Hmm.
found it inside a cave once again. So they were cavemen who were playing flutes. And not only that's just imagine the scale of that invention. You're inventing musical tradition and you're inventing a musical instrument, and that musical tradition and musical instrument has survived till the present day.
Hmm.
How many musical instruments or musical traditions have you invented?
Right.
So that tells you that they were also artistically inclined, they're musically oriented, and that's a indication of a high civilization.
Hmm.
And then you have all of these cave arts in France, Lascaux, I don't know the exact pronunciation. You have these amazing cave arts that you have in France, which date back to around 30,000 BCE, which shows that they had artistic capabilities. So medicine, surgery. They were also sailing. Now there's evidence that people in the Ice Age could sail across the oceans, and they found evidence of that. Not only genetic evidence, but also evidence in terms of certain artifacts which were found in the Greek islands, which indicate that they were sailing the oceans prior to the Ice Age.
Right.
Uh, so they had the basic skills of civilization were already there. We don't know much about the architecture, and that's always going to be a mystery. But as you said, the main determinant for the Golden Age is not all of these skills of civilization, it is the state of consciousness. Because in the Golden Age, we live in a state of soul consciousness. So every person reflects the virtues of the soul, which is, love and compassion and justice and truth and
Hmm.
harmony. And in the Iron Age, we devolve into ego consciousness. So people are caught up in their egoic desires and they manifest all the, the negative traits of the ego. So that's how we find anger and hatred and divisions and violence.
Hmm.
So that's the real devolution, the devolution of the consciousness. And in the ascending cycle, once again, we'll move from ego consciousness to soul consciousness. And along with that, whatever technologies are necessary will also be invented. But the technologies of the higher ages, when we look at this ancient text, when we read this text, we find that the technologies of the higher ages are more driven by consciousness than by material nuts and bolt technologies. So people in the higher ages have such an purified and elevated consciousness that they gain the ability to manipulate the elemental forces of nature like light or sound or gravity. And they can do miraculous tasks which seem like magic today or impossible to us today. But these are the kind of powers that are activated in a higher age because the kind of vibration that reaches us in the higher age changes. We don't have the same kind of vibrations that we have now on our planet. So, in my book, what I have proposed is that is the central black hole, which the Vedic sages call Brahma, which becomes active in the higher age. Because our black hole also has its own cycle. It's called an Aegean cycle, active galactic nucleus cycle. Sometimes the black hole becomes highly active and then it starts radiating at all frequencies of the EM spectrum, from infrared rays to gamma rays. Those energies, those vibrations, when they reach us, they trigger certain beneficial genetic mutations in our body that raises our consciousness and our cranial capacity and our physical structure. And then when that energy black hole shuts down, the vibrations gradually die off, and that's when we have negative mutations which reduce our physical size and carrying capacity, and also reduce the qualities of the environment. And geneticists have now found out that it's actually a factor of our genes. We're declining in physical size because our genes are deteriorating, where our cranial capacity is declining because our genes are deteriorating due to mutations. So we're going through a period of negative gene mutations. And the ascending cycle, we go through a period of positive gene mutations, which increases all of these factors.
Yeah. I mean, let's go into there. I am kind of drawn right now to want to touch back on some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, but now do it in kind of an organized way, which is I'd like to go back through this chart that you have of the Yuga cycle and it's hit these various power points that are reached and what we can track of the history of civilization as we move down from gold to silver to bronze to iron. So we talked about the cataclysmos period, and we speculated that there was a golden age on the other side of that, but there was the Younger Dryas period was reached, and the framework of the physical framework of the Earth was drastically changed for this 1200-year period. And then this was ended by the famous comic impact that, in Plato's teachings brought down Atlantis, representing the previous whole era of civilization that existed. And then, so that's around 9700 BC. And so then we have a 2700-year period of the Treta Yuga, and that culminates around 7000 BC. And you mentioned this period earlier, but can you go back over what what marked this change in civilization around 7000 BC, and what do we know about this era that set up the motion between the Treta Yuga and then the descent down into the Dwapara Yuga?
Yeah, that was a time when there was a bout of global flooding, and the Laurentide ice sheet disintegrated in North America, and it sent a wave of glacial waters into the North Atlantic, and that led to the flooding of the Black Sea, which is known as the Black Sea catastrophe. The Black Sea actually used to be a freshwater lake, but this flooding event turned it into half freshwater and half saline. The top portion of the Black Sea contains salt water, and the lower portion contains fresh water.
Mm.
And they found that this flooding was highly catastrophic and it destroyed a large civilization that existed around the coast of the Black Sea. Now, similar flooding events would have been going on in other parts of the world as well, but we don't have the data for that. Nobody's gone looking for the data for all the other flooding events. But if the Laurentide ice sheet had uh, collapsed at this point and increased global sea levels by around 5 or 6 feet, then we should have been having these kind of flooding events everywhere. So my surmise is that it was a time of floods, and there were some very powerful earthquakes in Sweden. So floods and earthquakes kind of ended the Treta Yuga.
So, do we know what caused the floods?
We don't. We don't. They said that we don't know why the Laurentide ice sheet suddenly collapsed. We know it collapsed. We know that there were earthquakes. Maybe earthquakes resulted in the collapse of the ice sheets, or there might have even been comet impacts, but nobody's looking for it in that time frame because comet impacts can not only destroy ice sheets, they can also trigger volcanic eruptions and cause earthquakes.
Hmm.
But we need to find the impact proxies before we can say it's a comet impact. So something happened which led to the collapse of the ice sheet and led to powerful earthquakes.
So the North American ice sheet didn't end with it wasn't destroyed with that massive flooding that Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock talk about. Do I have the datings must have been mixed up. So that didn't deluge North America, or did it during 9700 BC? It happened later, or it happened both times?
Happened both times. The
Okay.
Laurentide ice sheet was just one of the major ice sheets that remained, that did not get destroyed at the end
Oh,
of
okay.
the last ice. Yeah, so it was still there, and you had major glacial lakes forming just behind that ice sheet. So
Hmm.
when that ice sheet collapsed, those waters from the glacial lakes, they basically flooded out,
Hmm.
and they increased the global sea levels by 4 to 5 feet on average.
Okay.
And
So
then
there
you
was a
have a new
wiping. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and then you had a new wave of civilizations in Anatolia and southeastern Europe, and where they find that there's a very clear developmental leap in terms of new forms of pottery, new forms of artistic design,
Hmm.
which they didn't see prior to that period. But we don't have any data for the rest of the world for this particular time period. We just don't know what was going on elsewhere.
Right. All right. So then we have going from around 7000 BC. Actually, let me ask you this. Each of the ages is separated by a transition period of around 300 years. Can you describe the nature of those transition periods and basically what happens during that time period?
Yeah, it's simple. It's the older civilizations are destroyed either in a major cataclysms or in a series of cataclysms, and there's the emergence of a new kind of civilization in their place. So that's basically it.
So it's a very concentrated period of transformation where the downward trends of the previous 2700 years kind of culminate to a critical point, and then there's a rebirth and something different, something new emerges, basically. So in the Dwapara age that follows, it goes 2700 years, and that extends from 6700 BC to approximately 4000 BC. And you did mention this 4000 BC period earlier, but um, we can basically touch on that again. Is this the beginning of Bronze Age civilization?
Right after that period of transition. So the this particular period of transition ends in 3676 BCE, and that is followed by the Bronze Age civilizations
Hmm.
everywhere. And during that period of transition, you had Sahara turning into a desert, as did a large part of Arabia.
Hmm.
Before that, both Sahara and Arabia used to be green and fertile.
Hmm.
And they have found evidence of a major comet impact in the Indian Ocean, which dates to 3700 BC.
Okay.
This crater is called the Burkle Impact Crater. This impact event set off large tsunami waves, which created massive V-shaped chevron dunes off the coast of Australia and Madagascar. They used the material from these dunes to date the impact precisely to around 3700 BC. So there was also tsunami events taking place, impact events taking place that could have been the main catalyst for the transition that happened during this time when the older Neolithic societies were replaced by the Bronze Age societies that came up later.
Hmm. And well, it just it's kind of occurring to me that this book could never have been written 50 years ago because these new breakthroughs in geology and sort of climate or astrological impact analysis really breaks open the timing of this whole thing because you can see clearly how these different events that we're talking about, particularly these major transformative episodes with potential comet impacts, how they align with the various dates of the Yuga. If you didn't have the knowledge about these impacts and how and the transformations they brought about, you wouldn't have the data set required to anchor the theory.
Absolutely. I mean, not only the destruction events, but also the fact that we seem to have this periodic reemergence of civilizations. We didn't have data for, we had data for the Iron Age. We know the Iron Age cultures more or less started around 700 BC. We did have data for the Bronze Age, but we didn't know about Göbekli Tepe, that we had a new wave of civilizations in 9600 BC. Similarly, in Eastern Europe, they found evidence of a new wave of civilization in 6700, 6600 BC. But at least we have found it in one place. But for the rest of the world, when that came up very recently, we still don't have data for the rest of the world. So a lot of new data has come up, which has helped me to kind of piece it together,
Hmm.
um, in a way that kind of makes intuitive sense.
And so this period, 3600 BC, approximately the beginning of Bronze Age civilization. This actually also marks the beginning of the Kali Yuga,
Yeah, the descending Kali Yuga.
the descending Kali Yuga. And which is interesting because this is basically like if you go in your normal history textbook, this is the period when civilization is said to have started, basically modern
Yeah.
states. And really, we're talking about the first Kali Yuga civilizations actually starting during this period. The lowest point of civilization is what we consider the entirety of civilization, and this whole backstory is has been washed from our understanding, and so it's so critical to put the whole picture back together. But what off the top of your head, what are some of the characteristics of Age civilizations, and what we know that they completely fell apart over the course of about 2000 years, the rise and fall of these civilizations. But what characteristics do you think of these indicate that they are representations of the Kali archetype?
Well, at the beginning of the Bronze Age cultures, you wouldn't notice Kali Yuga archetype because it takes a bit of time for that archetype to manifest.
Hmm.
So at the beginning, they would have probably started off at the higher level,
Hmm.
but then they started to degrade, and we see that degradation obviously in the architecture and in the works that they produced. But also the increase in violence that is so much evident. If you look at the history of Egypt, it was the later part of dynastic Egypt. There were so many more wars which were being fought,
Hmm.
which you didn't have in the the old kingdom or the
Hmm.
middle kingdom. It's only in the new kingdom that you see Egypt becoming so warlike and fighting with its neighbors.
Hmm.
And in the Indus Valley, we don't have too much data, but uh, for the whatever data we have, we don't see the warring tendency too much in the Indus Valley. They seem to be a more peaceful civilization, but at the same time, they did not build on such a grand scale as Egypt. They were more moderate in their construction, more focused on building very nice, oriented grid-like cities with very good sewerage and drainage, much better than what you have in some Indian cities even today, with underground sewage, with swimming pools and stuff. But uh, we don't see much signs of warfare there. So that way, they probably remain peaceful, maybe for a longer duration than Egypt
Hmm.
before. And other parts, Mesopotamia, we the Sumerians were a peaceful lot, but later on, as they went to the Akkadian period, once again we see the emergence of violence and warring. And then the Assyrians in the Iron Age, they took it to a new level. They were really very violent culture. Uh, but that's we see this decline in architecture, we see a decline in works, artifacts, and we see an increase in violence. Those are primarily the Kali Yuga archetypes that you can discern from the uh, archaeological records. There might be some more, but I can't think of it at the top of my head right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the underlying things as we start to see a move of civilization towards empire, where it's like the old pattern of civilization being lived sort of in attunement with the expression of spiritual principles and the sort of idea that society is absorbed into a religious concept. Gradually, during the Bronze Age, you see a more ambition arise within rulers. You see more um, sort of materialistic concerns, the idea of building a material empire, as a monument to the greatness, not of God, but of these godlike rulers, comes into play. And so it's this like and the ambition of men sort of really sets in and drives a lot of this conflict, I think.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point about the statues of kings becoming bigger than the statues of the gods.
Hmm.
So the kings are more intent in glorifying themselves. So that's a sign of ego coming into the picture, pride
Right.
and ego coming into the picture. And empires mean more wars and more bloodshed. So
Hmm.
yeah, we do see that. And the priesthood also becomes more powerful in the older. If you go back to the Egypt Old Kingdom, you don't find so many rites and rituals as opposed to the ones that you have later on, where you have more texts coming up, more power to the priesthood.
Hmm.
Because and that is a natural outcome of the descending cycle. Because as you move down the cycle, there is an increase in misery, there's an increase in diseases, people are more frustrated, they live for a lower period of time. So obviously they need some help from outside sources, and that's how the priesthood becomes more powerful, because then they start inventing more texts and more rituals to get more money from the people.
Right. Manly P. Hall's a philosopher I've spent a lot of time studying. He's American and from the 20th century. And one of the things he emphasizes about this priesthood is that while they may have grown in power, the sort of quality of the priesthood gradually declines during this period. And the heart traditionally of the priesthood would have been the mystery schools and this sort of very disciplined initiation process. This is found all throughout the world. And gradually, he describes a process where society, for various reasons, stopped producing candidates eligible to attain the higher mysteries. And so, without access to those deeper levels of consciousness that those provide, there's less wisdom and understanding, and that compounds over time. And so there's this compounding dynamic that happens where like the priesthood is less able to guide with wisdom and intelligence the rulers, the society, and then society starts to fall into problems because of this lack of attunement between heaven and earth. And then those problems then, promote instability and infighting, but also, the rulers start to make decisions on their own and they start expressing authority over the priests. And so this whole like the whole harmony of the social order just gradually, it's like entropy moves in and acts upon it and pulls it apart and chips away at it. And then this process really culminates because all these Bronze Age civilizations across Eurasia, and I'm sure in America as well, but we know this in the River Valley civilizations of Eurasia, extending from Europe over to China, they all fall into like a total collapse by the end of this Bronze Age, which culminates around 970 BCE. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Bronze Age collapse was actually longer than the other ones. It extended from around 1100 to 700 BC. It was a period of around 400, 450 years. That was the time they collapsed in stages. There were many such events. So sometimes once the collapse happened, they started to rebuild, and again there was a collapse. There were many series of collapses. Ultimately, there was this dark age of around 300 odd years when no civilization actually existed, and some people lived like nomads here and there in small settlements. And in Greece, the effect was so strong that they forgot writing altogether.
Right.
and they had to relearn the alphabet from the Phoenicians at around 700 BC. So that's the kind of a change that happens during these time periods when it's kind of a period of dormancy, which also allows the planet to renew itself and rejuvenate itself so that it can sustain another round of civilization. That's also an important part. It's not only removing the evil kings, which is one of the purposes, because as we go down the cycle, the ego becomes stronger and there's more evil in the world. So it comes to remove that. Those evil kings who are causing all the problems, and it also renews the planet,
Mm-hmm.
returns it to a pristine state.
Mm-hmm.
So there are two objectives which are fulfilled.
Right. So it's within this period of Bronze Age civilization. So you in your model, it begins around 3700 BC, which makes sense. But traditionally, it's dated at 3100 BC. Can you talk a little bit about like the that tradition and sort of what your how extensive that assumption is about 3100 BC, but also what made you start to think critically about that and ultimately change your dating of it?
Yeah, 3102 BC date, which is generally said to be the beginning of the Kali Yuga, that is not mentioned in any ancient Indian Sanskrit text. And
Mm,
there's no evidence that any astronomer of India tried to calculate it himself. It's never mentioned. Not only the date is not mentioned, any effort, there's no effort at calculating the date. First time this date comes up is in a inscription in the 7th century AD, where it is said that this that the Kali Yuga, not the Kali Yuga, but there's a major war which took place at the boundary between the Kali Yuga and the Dwapar Yuga in the Indian tradition, and that's called the War of the Mahabharata. So, as per this particular inscription, the Mahabharata war happened in 3102 BCE, and later it became the beginning of the Kali Yuga. So I wanted to find out from where did this date crop up? I mean, 7th century AD is a fairly late date in the Indian historical period. By that time, India had already been conquered by the Persians. The western part was ruled by the Persians. Then there were Chinese tribes which ruled over northern India. So I found this article which has been written by a Dutch mathematician called Van Worden, and he wrote an article in 1980 in the Centaurus magazine about this 3102 BC date, and he showed very clearly that the Persians were the ones who had calculated this date. The Persians were trying to find out the date of the flood, and they assumed that there was a conjunction of the five visible planets in Aries uh, at the end of the Golden Age, after which there was the flood. And this particular tradition is also there in an Indian text, astronomy text called Surya Siddhanta, which says that conjunction of planets took place in Aries at the end of the Golden Age. The Persians used the same assumption, and they tried to date when that conjunction had happened. And in trying to do so, they arrived at 3102 BCE. Now, obviously, we know that the flood did not happen in 3102 BC. That is very clear to us now. It
mm,
happened either at the beginning of the Younger Dryas or at the end of the Younger Dryas. So that was the time that the flood would have happened. So 3102 BC date cannot be the date of the flood. That's number one. Number two, there was no conjunction of planets in 3102 BC. There was a rough alignment of planets. And the reason why the Persians thought that there was a conjunction is because they were using a wrong value for the motion of Saturn. This is
mm,
what Van Worden found out, that there was no conjunction, and the reason why they thought there was a conjunction is because they were using an inaccurate value for the motion of Saturn. So that date is not, first of all, a conjunction of planets is said to have occurred at the beginning of at the end of the Golden Age and not at the end of the Kali Age. Secondly, a conjunction of the 3102 BC date, you do not actually have any conjunction.
mm,
So on those two bases, we can say that this is basically an inaccurate date which was calculated by the Persians to find the date of the flood. And then the Persians conquered large parts of Western India between the first century AD and the third century AD and set up kingdoms there. During this time, a lot of Persian priests were called Magi. They came and established themselves as Brahmins in India, and they were called Magha Brahmins. Instead of Magi, we call them Magha Brahmins. And they were also the priests of the sun temples, which came up in India at that time because the Persians were worshippers of sun and Mithra. So that is the time probably when this 3102 BC date came into India. But in India, they found that the Indians were more concerned about the date of the Kali Yuga and the Mahabharata war than the flood. And so it became associated with the beginning of the Mahabharata war and later with the beginning of the Kali Yuga. But this has actually no relation to the Kali Yuga at all. It was a miscalculation by the Persians to find the date of the flood.
Mm. It's interesting. The themes of the Kali Yuga are very much expressed in this story of the dating of it because there's just this compounding errors and ignorance and sort of like adherence to a tradition that's not totally in alignment, and so it kind of builds off of error after error. Um, but yeah, because it's interesting that you're saying that because that dating is just so wide, even to this day, is just so widely referenced, and it's just been referenced throughout so many years of history, like scripture go back a long ways. But it's interesting that you date it back to this original attempt by the Persians to and they couldn't have known what we know today, but this idea that they were going to settle on this being the start date for it, and then it just sort of takes on a life of its own.
Yeah, and it's not me, it's Van Warden who wrote that article, and I am lucky to have found that article and understood what actually happened.
Right. And I mean, that's it's an important breakthrough, or at least an important theory to put out there because, I mean, is your work and his article the only places you've really seen make this kind of take a critical eye towards this, and then which in turn set the stage for this this sort of redating of it? Are you really the only person who are now pushing it back to the date where you do have it, which is around 3700 BC?
Yeah, because I used a calendar. In India, there's a calendar called the calendar of the seven sages or the Saptarshi calendar.
Uh-huh.
The seven sages are very important from the perspective of Hindu tradition. They are they're not mortals. When you read the text, they're not presented as mortals. They're said to be the mind-born sons of Brahma. They are
Hmm.
luminous beings of light, and they appear on the earth at the beginning of every age, every yuga, and they repromulgate the Vedic knowledge. And all the Indian texts which relate to astronomy or music or grammar or architecture were said to have been composed by these seven sages. And we find the tradition of the seven sages in all other cultures. Even Greece had this concept of seven sages. In the Iron Age, they actually, even in the Iron Age, although the seven sages did not actually appear in the Iron Age, the Greeks identified seven particular philosophers and called them the seven sages.
Hmm.
And the Mesopotamians had this concept of the seven sages. They called them the Apkallu. The Sumerians called them the Apkallu, which means seven sages. And they were depicted as these hybrid beings, human fish hybrids. You might have seen those pictures. This Oannes, who's got this head of a fish on top of his head. The lower part of
Right.
his body is a fish.
Yeah.
And then there's some beings with a head of an eagle or a vulture, and lower part is that of a human. So they were depicted as human bird hybrids or human fish hybrids. And they said that all the knowledge, Berosus wrote this, that all the knowledge that the Babylonians have in every field was given to them by the seven sages. And till that time, nothing new has been invented. So it was widely prevalent. And in India, we have this concept of the seven sages as well. And the seven sage, there's a calendar called the cycle of the seven sage or the Saptarshi calendar.
Hmm.
This calendar has a duration cycle of 2,700 years, which is called a Saptarshi Yuga. So I used this particular Saptarshi Yuga as the basis of the Yuga cycle, as the duration of a particular Yuga. But since the Yuga duration is actually 3,000 years, what I said was the remaining 300 years years must be the period of transition between two yugas. So I use the calendar as the framework, and this was the most important calendar in ancient India. When you look at ancient Indian dates, they were all tracked by the Saptarshi calendar.
Hmm.
And even now, it is used in some parts, although with the advent of the Gregorian calendar, it has lost its usage to a large extent. So one of the starting points of this calendar is 6676 BCE, which is uh, this you can find out from historical sources that one of the starting points is 6676 BC. And again, using historical sources, we can determine that this was the beginning of the Dwapara Yuga in the descending cycle. So that was my premise that the Saptashi calendar was used for tracking this cycle. The 6676 BC date denotes the beginning of the Dwapara in the descending cycle, and the duration of a particular Yuga is 2700 years, which is the duration of a Saptarshi Yuga. And
Hmm.
using this, I calculated the entire cycle.
Hmm.
So it's based on a well-known ancient Indian calendar. And then I found out that the Tibetan Kalachakra Tantra uses the same calendar for the Yuga cycle model,
Mm.
which means this knowledge was also there in India because the Tibetan Kalachakra Tantra is based on ancient Sanskrit texts that were transferred from India to Tibet. But
Hmm.
then, when India came under the Islamic invasions from the 10th century onwards, all of these texts were destroyed. And that knowledge was completely erased from India about these cycles, about this particular framework.
Right.
But it survived in Tibet. And
Hmm.
in Tibet, they use the Saptarshi calendar to calculate their Yuga cycle framework. And I wrote this in my book. Right now, they believe that it's in 2425 that the current age ends. But I've shown that there are a couple of deviations which are there in their text, and it should actually be 2025. But that will probably be a bit too complicated for this
Well, you know what's
discussion.
interesting? 24, 25. That aligns approximately with how Manly Hall dates the ending of the Piscean age and the transfer to the Aquarian age.
Okay.
Um, I think it's right around 2400. So there is an interesting alignment there. One thing I want to say about the idea of the septenary and the Rishi, Manly Hall talks a lot about this in his work on going to the philosophy of astrology. He notes that how this idea of the seven, the significance of it is encapsulated astronomically in I think it's the Little Dipper, which points to the north precessional
Yeah.
axis or the north celestial zodiac, and that ties into the cycle of the great year, and it was like one of the markers that the ancient used in terms of like where the handle points is like how you would date where you are in this larger time cycle. So it makes sense like that would be the master cycle of date of grounding your analysis of the sort of like large scale motions of the earth and the cosmos. And it seems like the Greeks pointed to it. It seems like the ancient Indians pointed to it. I think it's no, I know for sure it's also there in ancient Chinese astrology, the emphasis on this constellation and all of them have this concept critically emphasized of the importance of seven as an esoteric significance to it, and the gods are always in the number of seven. It's the same as true in Mahayana Buddhism. So there's these interesting alignments, and these to me give support to your to the work you did and the theory that you're putting forth.
And one of the dates, one of the durations that we find in the Greek text for the duration of the great year was given by Heraclitus of Ephesus, and he says it's 10,800 years. Now, if you divide that by four, you get 2,700 years, which is exactly the same as what I have.
Hmm.
So Heraclitus of Ephesus gave a duration of the great year excluding the periods of transition. So he was just talking about the four 2,700 year cycles, multiplied it by four, and came up with 10,800 years. So that's another confirmation. And the point that we're talking about the Big Dipper, that's true. In India, we identify the seven sages with the seven prominent stars of the Great Bear,
Hmm.
which is also a major constellation. and that's a circumpolar constellation. So it's very close to the pole star. And
Mm-hmm.
one of those stars points to Polaris.
Mm-hmm.
And as per the tradition, the seven sages influence each of the 27 lunar houses along the ecliptic.
Mm-hmm.
So we divide the ecliptic. I mean, there are two divisions of the ecliptic. One is the 12 zodiac
Right.
constellations, which we know about. There's another division which is more granular, and that divides it into 27 equal parts because the moon spends one day in each of these 27 houses in course of its revolution around the earth.
Right.
So each of these is called a lunar house. So if you look at the sky today, the moon will be at night, the moon will be in a particular lunar house. And if you
Mm-hmm.
look at it tomorrow, it will move to the next lunar house. So
Right.
it tracks the monthly movement of the moon. And as per the tradition, the Great Bear, the seven sages, they spend 100 years in each of these lunar houses. And that adds up to the 27,000 year cycle. So
Mm.
each lunar house is basically influenced energetically by the seven sages for a period of 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you get 2,700 years cycle.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I'm glad you mentioned the lunar houses. The like typically in the definitely in the West, when we think of astrology, we think of a solar version of astrology, and that's the one that emphasizes the 12 zodiacal ages. But traditionally in the East, the lunar approach to astrology was actually primarily emphasized involving these houses. So I always had this idea that, and I'm glad you mentioned this, and I look forward to going deeper into the book and seeing what you say about it. But I had this idea that the Indian astrological system would in some way, this master cycle of the yugas would in some way interface with this idea of the lunar mansions and just more generally the lunar side of astrological analysis.
Yeah, we do give more importance to the lunar houses. We call them nakshatras. And it seems that when you do a birth chart, the lunar house is very important. That
Right.
gives you more specific information about your characteristics than a very broad zodiacal value.
Right. Now, I know you mentioned it before. Will you just touch on it one more time? How you calculated or what went into calculating this period of 300 years transition? Like, did that come out as part of a necessary thing to make the numbers work? Or is that part of the tradition of the yugas, these transition periods? And like, how to specifically, because I'm understanding now about the 2,700 years and you told you about how you derive that. And we talked earlier about the cataclysmos period of 1,200 years and where that comes from. But those 300-year intermediary periods, like, okay, what's the backstory of that?
That's because the Persians say that the 12,000 year cycle is divided into four yugas of 3,000 years each. So each yuga is 3,000 years. And Indian astronomers like Aryabhatta, Srishana, Paulissa, they all say the same thing that every yuga is of equal duration of 3,000 years.
Hmm.
So if I use 2,700 years as the actual duration of a yuga, and I know that there are intervening periods for which different values are given, sometimes at the end of the golden age. For instance, in the older model, at the end of the golden age, the intervening period is 400 years. At the end of the bronze age is 300 years. At the end of the Dwapara Yuga is 200 years. And at the end of the Iron Age is 100 years. So in the older model, they all decline from 400 to 100 years. But in
Hmm.
my model, what I'm saying is that the duration is 2,700 years, in which case the remaining 300 years has to be the period of transition because the duration of each yuga is 3,000. So the remaining 3,300 years has to be the period of transition because we know that there is a period of transition. So there has to be some amount left over. And for me, that's 300 years.
Hmm. So is this an original feature of your model, in terms of your Yuga
Yeah,
model?
yeah. Because I don't think anybody else prior to me used the calendar of the seven sages for tracking the Yuga cycle.
Right,
I was the first one to use that particular calendar
right,
because I thought that the something as important as the Yuga cycle must be tracked by some kind of a calendar. It can't
right,
be just because people need to, even if somebody forgets, if you know the calendar, you know which part of the Yuga cycle we are in.
right.
And the Saptashri calendar was the most important calendar in ancient India, which makes
Right.
it the most likely candidate for tracking this cycle.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. Um, all right, so let's pick back up with our historical analysis here. We're moving to the first half of the Kali Yuga and or the first the descending phase of it, and that reaches its end around 976 BC. And as we talked about during this period, and also in the transition period, moving up to 676 BC, we see the total collapse of Bronze Age civilization. And we also know that the traditional dating of the Kali Yuga is in this period, around 3100 BC. Now, one of the things I talk a lot about in the book that I am writing and that features the Kali Yuga prominently is there's this historical symmetry that happens here when we look at the themes of today, and then going back to what seed may have been planted in the beginning that's now sprouted and reaching its blossoming today, because we should find some type of asymmetry, in my feeling, with these yugas. Something should be started in the beginning and reach its culmination at the end of the age, like a theme is playing out. And one of the things that we see during this periods of Bronze Age collapse, and something that kind of reaches a initial culminating point during this period of transition around the 6th century BC, is that we see the economic institutions of society, the banking, the money, the economic organization. Originally, in the older days, the more you go back, that was run by the temple. But gradually, you see it moving out of the temple control and into the state control. And then from the state, it gradually moves into privatized hands, basically the formation of oligarchies. And the beginning of the institutions of capitalism begin to emerge through this process. So we see this at the very beginning of the Kali Yuga. We see this move of economic management out of the temple and into the state bureaucracy, into the control of the monarch. And then gradually, as this Kali Yuga moves towards its midpoint around the 7th, 6th century BC, we see the rise of a new type of empire and a new type of power structure where these independent, like merchant banking families, their wealth originated with the trading between different nations. This group of people developed a sort of independent wealth and independent perspective. And these people take their independent wealth and then move back into the states that they're trading between and begin to take control and basically corrupt them. And this becomes the beginning of oligarchy. And these oligarchs start to form this new brand of empire, which is like very extractive. It creates a ton of slavery in the world. It erodes society with debt. This starts coming out in full force right around the midpoint of the Kali Yuga cycle. And this is one of the main themes of the book, because we look at today, these same things seem to be coming into their full culmination today when we look at empire and capitalism and oligarchy and things like that. So let's look at this period from around when the transition period between the Kali Yuga Bronze Age collapse takes place, these social trends are emerging, and then this midpoint happens, this transition period between basically 900 BC and 600 BC, and then we see the second half of the Kali Yuga play out. And so there's these themes that are woven in between. But talk about the reemergence of how the decline of Bronze Age civilization kind of bottomed out for a couple hundred years, and then there was a reemergence of a new type of civilization, definitely born from the predecessor, but featuring these new characteristics. And one of these characteristics was definitely the rise of oligarchy and a new type of governance structure.
Yeah, that's right. And the religion also changed. I mean, the religion, the Bronze Age gods and goddesses were kind of replaced by some new ones. And we see also the rise of what you call democracy. I mean, the Bronze Age cultures were more based on a monarch, and the monarch was regarded as the intermediary between heaven and earth. He got the mandate to rule,
Mm-hmm.
and the priesthood basically made him go through an initiation. So you had the concept of a priest king in the Bronze Age,
Mm-hmm.
which gradually deteriorated throughout the Bronze Age. But in the Iron Age, you now suddenly find the emergence of democracy, and people decide for themselves who they want to rule. And that's we pride ourselves on our democracy today, but the problem with democracy is that it can be taken over and corrupted by the oligarchs, by the capitalists. And then there's virtually no escape from it anymore. In case of a monarchy, you might sometimes have a good monarch and sometimes a bad monarch. So it can fluctuate up and down. But if the democracy has been completely captured by a group of oligarchs, then you always have the same system, no matter who's in power, which
Right.
is what we have today. And then there were new art forms. The artistic styles of the Bronze Age were completely gone. And in the Bronze Age, there used to be this monumental, this megalithic stone structures.
Hmm.
Like in Egypt, you find these megalithic monuments, and that was not brought forward. Although in Greece, you do have these very big temples, but for the most part, in the Iron Age, people started building at a more moderate scale as opposed to the Bronze Age scale.
Hmm.
And so there's a difference in artistic patterns and architectural styles, in modes of governance, and also there's a changeover in the gods. And then there was this emergence of a new wave of philosophers. Like in India, we had Buddha. He came and reached a new concept, which you can find in the Vedanta or the Bhagavad Gita, but which was hidden from the people at large.
Hmm.
During the Bronze Age collapse, people forgot the meaning of meditation or forgot their higher self, that it can be accessed. So someone like Buddha came along and gave a new set of principles and a new set of practices.
Hmm.
Similarly, in China, you had Confucius. In Persia, Zoroaster came up with a new religious concept, a new set of principles. In Greece, you had a new set of philosophers who were giving new ideas. So there was a change in philosophy and religion, and which kind of set the trend for the first half of the ascending cycle.
Hmm.
Uh, but even those ideas slowly became corrupted, and when Buddhism became too complex. If you look at the early version of Buddhism, which is there in Sri Lanka, that's a very simple form of instructions.
Right.
But then over a period of time, it incorporated so many complexities. And if you read some of the later Buddhist texts, it's so difficult to even understand what
Right.
they're saying.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a good point. Let me just interject real quick. So we at the same time we see these rise of these expansionist empires during there's a period of time that some historians call the axial age. I call it that a lot in my work. And it extends for roughly 1,000 years from 600 BC to around 400 AD. And during that period, the whole structure of pagan civilization, a classical civilization, completely falls apart and then is replaced by the modern world order beginning in the Middle Ages. But you see the spread of these conquering empires whose domains expand across these different cultures, culminating in really in the Roman Empire, which was like expanding out all throughout Europe. But there were other empires that emerged. India had their version of a great empire, I think under Ashoka. There were these great empires in China. So it was this phase of civilization that involved empire, and there was just a tremendous amount of suffering that brought about, and also just a transformation of the native cultures of regions were being kind of eroded and destroyed by this process of this constant war and the militarization of the world. And one of the things that happens with oligarchy that's different than monarchy is that, in monarchy you can have a bad king, but the or a good king, but the thing is there's a person who's empowered to make change. And there's instances throughout history where you see the rise of a ruler who makes these fundamental changes and kind of restores civilization. But with oligarchy, because no one single individual rules, nobody has the power to rein it in. So it builds up this momentum because these different interest groups, the only thing they have in common really is the perpetuation of this machine. Once it's in place, it's basically like destined to expand and then fall apart. So we're thinking about a midpoint period of the Kali Yuga, its own lowest point almost, where its principles and themes are expressed in a very concentrated way. This period fits the bill because on one hand you have this tremendous amount of suffering that took place during this period. I mean, I can't remember what the number is, but a huge percentage of people were enslaved during this period, like a very large
and,
amount of
and,
people
and
were enslaved by these
and the
empires.
and the religious wars, and then those colonial wars. I mean, it
Right,
just continued throughout the whole period.
right. But at the same time, like you said, that there was during the same period, particularly 600, the 6th century BC, the same period where these empires are really roaring up, and would continue throughout the age. We also see the birth of the great world teachers, which come within the span of 100 years all around the world, as almost a coordinated movement. We see these emergence of these teachers who bring these teachings out that used to be reserved exclusively for the high priests of the religion. They sort of take the wisdom teachings, they repackage them in a way and give them life in a new form, a new institutional form. And this becomes philosophy. And it happened in India, it happened in China, it happened in Greece, it happened in Persia. There's evidence that it happened in a form in the Americas. And so this is an important event because while you're right, outwardly in time, these many of these philosophical schools would they will become basically turned into religions. The core wisdom teachings still remained, and this idea of a new vehicle of philosophy emerging to carry forward the teachings of the past, the wisdom teachings that used to be preserved for the priesthood. There's now a network established where I think going down to present day, these knowledge traditions are preserved and given life to navigate these treacherous times that are going to be taking place during the Kali Yuga. I mean, for example, both the work that we do in terms of my channel and then you and with this book would only be possible or has only been possible because of the emergence of these schools and this idea that there was a vehicle now offered to carry forward these wisdom teachings from the past so that we could gain access and rediscover them today.
Yeah, that's right. And because every yoga you need to have these teachers coming up in every yoga because the energies change, the mindset changes. So people themselves change to a large extent because of the different vibrations. So our intellect also declines, and we are not able to carry out many of or understand many of the complex philosophies that might have existed in the past. So these teachers come along to simplify it
Hmm.
and spread it to the masses because they know that this is one of the darkest periods and the people need the simple wisdom which they can practice in their home. But
Hmm.
over time we started making these big temples which did not really exist, especially in India, for instance. In the beginning, we didn't really have these big temples. We just had very simple shrines,
Hmm.
but then over a period of time, the king started building these big temples just to to glorify themselves mainly. And the rituals took over and the underlying messages were forgotten.
Right. In alignment with the themes of the Kali Yuga, you would almost expect that to happen. Um,
Yeah.
but the
And then
seed. Go ahead.
you had this big religious war. I mean, the Islamic invasions, then Christianity taking over the whole of Europe and the
Right.
pagan religions getting wiped out, Islamic invasions in large parts of the world. You didn't have those kind of wars in the Bronze Age. You did have wars in the Bronze Age, but they were mainly between kingdoms. So somebody was attacking somebody else, but there wasn't the spread of a single religious concept across the world. But you
Hmm.
see that here with single religion taking over large parts of the world,
Right.
and then in the colonial period that spreads into the Americas, Native Americans, and then the South America. They all come under
Right.
the sway of the conquistadors. So yeah, that's one more theme where so much of knowledge has been lost in the process of the eradication of the native culture. So it's almost impossible to get that knowledge back now. Whatever was written in these cultures is all gone to a large extent.
Right.
So we are
And
right now at the end. We're right now trying to piece together from whatever little is left over.
right. Yeah. Well, so I want to build up to the present moment, where we're at today, just in a moment. But I want to also just mention in this model of the yugas, the ages proceed one after another, right, in sequence. But when you reach the Kali Yuga, the bottom level, and also when you reach the top level, the Satya Yuga, you get an age back to back. And this has to do with the downward cycle moving into the upward cycle. But I just want to point out the beginning of the Bronze Age, when we were just talking, that was the beginning of the Kali Yuga. Then a 2700 year Kali Yuga period commences, and then there's a 300-year transition, but then another Kali Yuga comes right after it. And so, can you talk a little bit about the difference between the first half of this and then the second half, and what you might expect the downward versus upward trajectories to differ? I mean, one of these things we already talked about how, certain things were set up in the beginning of the Bronze Age, was played out and almost reached a culminating point as we go into the 6th century, 7th century BC, and that there is this new axial age that emerges during this period with the world teachers and these oligarchies and empires and stuff. So it does make sense that there's a move towards something that's culminating, and now going up to today, we're playing out the after effects or the full consequences of these changes that took place around the axial age. But can you just talk a little bit about how the Kali Yuga goes back to back here, and how um, really, do you look at it as constituting one overarching cycle of like almost 6,000 years?
Yeah, the difference is that in the first half of the Kali Yuga, there is a decline both in our material dimensions of life as well as the spiritual dimensions of life. Our consciousness is declining, and the material prosperity is also declining,
Right.
and our lifespan is also declining. And there's data for that which shows that throughout the Bronze Age, our lifespan was declining. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, had a ideal lifespan of around 110 years.
Hmm.
But by the time of the Ptolemies in the early Iron Age, their average lifespan had fallen to around 50 years. So
Hmm.
there was this decline throughout the Bronze Age in lifespan which took place. The ascending Yuga cycle is when there is an increase in material prosperity, but the decline in consciousness continues throughout the ascending Yuga cycle. And that is also reflected in the data. For instance, the cranial capacities have declined till now. Even now, it's declining, but it's kind of flattening out, which shows that our consciousness, our memory, our subtle abilities have been declining throughout the entire descending cycle till now. But our physical size actually stopped declining after the late Bronze Age collapse. From around 1000 BC or 900 BC, roughly, there has been a slight increase in our physical size. We are not declining anymore physically, although we are still declining in terms of cranial capacity. So our consciousness is declining, but our physical size is increasing. And increasing life, and our lifespan has also been increasing from 50 odd years at around the late Bronze Age collapse. It has now increased to around 80 odd years at the end of the Kali Yuga. Now, if you live for a longer period of time, and if you are also bigger and stronger, then you accumulate more wealth, and you can pass it on to future generations. So there has been an increase in material prosperity in the Kali Yuga,
Right.
but that has been so. Right now, what you have is kind of a gap between matter and spirit. There's at least in many parts of the world there is sufficient material prosperity, but at the same time the consciousness has basically reached rock bottom. So there's this gap between our material and spiritual dimensions, and that gap has to be bridged in the next transition period so that our material prosperity and our spiritual evolution go hand in hand, and you don't end up with such a big gap.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense what you're saying. I mean, there was a definite decline in the material structure of civilization up to a point of like almost total collapse by the end of the Bronze Age, by the end of that first Kali Yuga cycle. And then the second one, there's been an obvious building back up of this material prosperity, and also of the, I mean, this is an important point of the interconnection of civilization to the point where we sit on the cusp of a truly global civilization, a world structure of government. And that hasn't been experienced since the fall of Atlantis. I mean, the fall of the last ice age. We presumably there was a global civilization at one point, corresponding to the Atlantis myth. Um, so it's almost like we're coming full circle in a way in that sense, but at the same time, the state of consciousness has been, in many ways, is as low as it's ever been. Certainly not within everybody, but within the vast majority of people living on the earth today. And there's also just a tremendous amount of suffering going on in so many parts of the world. Like, I would even say the majority of people on earth today are living in very dire circumstances.
And yes, a lot of the suffering is mental in nature. You might find somebody who's comparatively well off materially, but the suffering is internal, and the anger or the frustration or the despair, it actually builds up internally. If your relationships are not going well, if you hate your office job, if you don't have good relations with your parents, if your life is messed up in many other ways, then even if you have material prosperity, you're not really happy. So that's what we mean by living in ego consciousness. We have forgotten that we are spiritual beings having a temporary human existence, and when you forget that, you think you're completely engrossed in the outer world, which is the world of duality. And if you think that you can get all your happiness from the outer world, then you'll automatically end up with a lot of misery. So, which is why a balanced life requires you to spend part of your time in developing yourself spiritually to clean up your ego consciousness. Because we spend so much time cleaning our physical bodies and dressing up in nice clothes, but we don't seem to spend the same amount of time cleaning our minds of the
Mm,
egoic dross that keeps on accumulating over time. And before you know, you're sending out negative vibrations, which is driving away everything positive, everything that is positive in your life. So that is the problem with the Kali Yuga, is that the ancient teachings are completely forgotten and
right,
ignored. It's taken out of the syllabus. We don't learn it in school. We don't learn it in school in India either. I mean, we used to learn it before the Brits were here, but now the syllabus is completely Western. So we don't know about our ancient texts. We don't have this wisdom within the masses. So it's only somebody who's looking for the information can go there and still find it.
right,
So if you are brought up to believe that just by engaging, but just by acquiring more wealth and power, you can be happy, then you are going down the wrong trajectory, and that is the cause of the suffering. And once you are suffering, you are causing more suffering to somebody else. So a banker who's frustrated with his life is not going to think twice about starting a war in, let's say, Ethiopia.
right,
So you're multiplying that unhappiness across the world.
right. I want to point out another interesting historical symmetry. We're looking at the second half of the Kali Yuga now, beginning around 600 BC, then moving up to present day, and the midpoint of the cycle would correspond approximately 700 AD, 800 AD, and that's when Europe basically sinks into its version of a dark age, when there's almost a similar type of thing to Bronze Age collapse with like the fall of Rome, fall of classical civilization, the rise of the Roman Catholic Church. There's like a decline in literacy and intelligence and lifespan among the masses. And so Europe really falls into a very low point, and we actually call it the Dark Ages, even though this whole collective period is called the Dark Ages in Hindu philosophy. But historically, we tend to look at this period of time marking the beginning of the Middle Ages as being the Dark Ages. Now that's in Europe. In the Middle East, at this point, there's almost a miniature golden age. There's a high point of civilization there, and I know that. I mean, I don't know exactly what the details are in India and China at this period. I have to look that up again, but I do know that around this time there was a great Buddhist school that prospered. I think it was in India, and so there was a relatively high point, at least in Buddhist culture, during this period. But can you talk a little bit about the midpoint? And do you also expect that when you were looking at these other ages, that there would be these sort of miniature cycles taking place within each one of these, and each should
Yeah.
have its quarter points and midpoints and things like that?
Um, I wouldn't say quarter or midpoints. I'd probably think that there are cycles within cycle, and one of the important cycles is the conjunction cycle of Jupiter and Saturn, which
Mm,
takes place every 20 years. So that plays a role, and the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle, there's uh, after every 240 or 260 years, then there's another cycle which begins.
right.
And the entire cycle is around 1,000 odd years.
Hmm.
So it's like 250, 250, 250, 250. That's the Jupiter Saturn conjunction cycle. So you might expect something happening every quarter as well.
Hmm.
Something changing every 20 years, something changing every 240 or 50 years, and then something changing every 1,000 years within that 2,700 year cycle. So what happened in Europe was probably could have been one of those Jupiter Saturn conjunction cycles, which extended maybe for 150 years or maybe even 500 years. So those differences will be there, and I'm sure those differences were also there in the Bronze Age. But it's so difficult to go back into the past and work out what was going on where
Right.
exactly. But in
Um,
India,
yeah.
we did have in India from the 5th century AD onwards, we did have a miniature golden age in terms of royal architecture, in terms of grammar and literature. There was a flowering of that in the mid 5th century. And yeah, there's a Buddhist school called Nalanda, which came up during that time. It was the biggest university in the world at that time. And
Yeah,
people
yeah, that
came
was
from yeah, and people came from all across Asia to study at the school at Nalanda. So it
right,
was between 5th century to 10th century AD, it was kind of a high point in culture and literature and music and civilization. But then again, we went into a dark age after that.
right,
After the Islamic invasions, we went into a dark age for around 600, 700 years.
right. All right, so now we're moving towards present day, and in your dating, you have actually next year, 2025, as being the beginning of the transition out of the Kali Yuga. This is something this is one of the reasons I orient a lot of my book around this theme of the Kali Yuga, because I also kind of reasoned that the Kali Yuga cycle would be ending was ending today for, various reasons. And so I kind of take that cycle of the Kali Yuga and use it as a means to organize my basically presentation of history that I offer in the book. And also my analysis of what's happening in American Empire and how American Empire has really been positioning itself to die and then be reborn into this global government. At this point, the fact that this is happening is almost undeniable. We talk about the Great Reset and things like that. And especially since 2020, and 2020 is actually interesting. You mentioned the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. There was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 2020. And really, 2020 does mark this pivotal transition point in which we're now like full blast going into this transition in the global government, along with a number of other things like technocracy and I think the potential of a lot of different things happening in the world. But we haven't fully moved into it, so we're sitting on the precipice of it, and we don't have the benefits of that transformation, but we have the deconstruction of basically the whole social order of the past, basically the scientific age, industrial age, the age of revolutions, the rise of democracies and republics that happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. That whole social order is now being deconstructed, and there's a tremendous amount of sort of chaos and suffering in the world. So all these themes that are happening very much align with these Kali archetypes, but also suggest a transition. And so it makes sense that this dating of the Kali Yuga as reaching its culmination phase at the present moment makes sense on so many levels. So what are in your research or just your opinion, what are your expectations for this upcoming period? And can you also go a little bit into what comes after? You have I'm going to mispronounce this again, the Ekapirosis period. And this is going to be 1200 years. And this is a mirror of the Cataclysmos period of 1200 years, which began during that Younger Dryas period. So, what are your expectations during this upcoming culmination of the Kali Yuga and what we're moving into?
Well, first of all, when we look at the ancient texts, there always seems to be increase in warfare at the transition periods. And the planetary energy changes. People um, try to, the basically the rich and the powerful, they try to increase their share. So that's what triggers these wars. And this has happened every time. The last 3 ages, the same thing has happened. There's an eruption of violence at the end of of a yuga, and that seems to be what's going on even now. That we are going into a period of instability and violence. Second thing that is likely to happen, in my opinion, is that there's going to be this emergence of a global consciousness or a planetary consciousness, as in people across the world would, some people across the world would see what's going on. They would try to disconnect from the decaying energies of the Kali Yuga, and they try to remember who the original teachings, remember the ancient wisdom, and that then use that to kind of chart out their own philosophies. And that has also been happening for maybe 50, 70 odd years, but is going to get more and more momentum as we go along because the there's going to be a culmination period. And one of the important things that happen during these periods is the renewal, the destruction of the old civilization. And my research indicates that it's actually a swarm of comets which is located within the torrid meteor stream, and we run into this swarm every 2,500 to 3,000 odd years, and then it bombards us for a period of few centuries. And we're going through this swarm in the years 2032 and 2036. And the 2036 date in particular is very important because that's also the date that Edgar Casey had mentioned as the date for the potential return of the Savior. He said 36, and people assume that he meant 1936, but Casey never said 1936. He said 36. And then in another reading, he said that in 36, the major changes will become apparent. And then in another reading, he says that in 36, the equilibrium of the earth will be disturbed in space, and the sun will be darkened, and the earth will be broken up in many places. So he was clearly referring to 2036 because that's one of the dates when we pass through this comet and meteor stream. And I look at 2036 as a pivotal moment for the collapse of the existing civilization. So, and then 2040, we have a conjunction of planets in Libra. I spoke about the conjunction of planets in Aries that took place in the Golden Age. Now, according to the same astronomical school, there are two conjunctions, one which takes place in Aries at the end of the Golden Age, and one which takes place in Libra at the end of the Iron Age or the descending cycle. So there are two conjunctions at opposite points. And
Hold on.
this
So let me
conjunction of
ask you real quick. Are you talking about this original conjunction of Aries having been at around 25 or 10,500 BC?
10,900, 800 BC, around that time.
Okay. And there's evidence that this, I mean, with all
No, we
the
don't,
software
I
that we
don't know.
have now, this is
No,
like
no,
demonstrated.
no. No, it's not been demonstrated. I'm saying that this would have happened at around that time, but nobody has gone exactly looking for that conjunction, and I don't have the skills to figure it out myself. So
And are we talking
somebody
about
else
all the
has to.
planets from
The f-
Mercury to Saturn, basically?
the five visible planets. So Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These are the five geocentric planets which are
Right.
visible to the naked eye. So those that particular conjunction would have taken place at around 10,900 BC, just before the Young
Right.
Dryas period, but nobody has gone looking for it exactly. But there's another conjunction which takes place at the end of the descending cycle. This one happens in Libra, which is the exact opposite sign to Aries. And this particular conjunction is going to happen in 2040 when all the five planets, as well as the crescent moon, will cluster in a 10-degree area of the sky in
Hmm.
Libra in September 2040.
And this is for
And I
sure
believe
that
this
this
is
will
for sure.
happen.
This is from NASA. I mean, this is
Right.
100%.
Right.
And I believe this is the conjunction that we're talking about because the conjunction of the five planets within a 10-degree area of the sky is extremely rare. Any conjunction within a 10-degree area of the sky happens once in 1,000 years.
Hmm.
And for this to happen in Libra, which is the specific constellation which was marked out by the ancient astronomers, is
Hmm.
the chance is once in 1 in 12,000 years.
Hmm.
So that makes it like a once in a Yuga cycle phenomenon.
Right.
And I believe this is the conjunction which marks the absolute end of the descending cycle. And beyond that, the Kali Yuga structures and ideologies and philosophies are unlikely to survive.
Hmm.
Then we move into this period of ecpirasis when I believe we'll have some more alignments, planetary realignments, but there'll be some survivors who will then move into the period of ecpirasis, and they'll set the kind of foundations for the ascending Yuga cycle over the next 1,000 odd years. And that lines up with some of the eschatological texts. For instance, in the Revelations, it says that after Christ comes, he's going to rule for 1,000 years with the resurrected holy men. I believe that refers to that period of ecpirasis when I believe that the interdimensional veils will be opened and we'll come in contact with all of these spiritual beings, the entities, the gods and the angels and the sages.
Hmm.
They'll manifest and they will transmit the wisdom to the people who will survive this 15-year period of transition between now to 2040. And they'll transmit the new set of wisdom and guidance. And these people will then evolve over a 1,000-year period, and set the foundation for the ascending cycle. And what I also expect is that the central black hole will probably enter into its active phase during this period, and will start getting the DNA upgrades as well during this period. So it will be a very different time to live, in my opinion, a dramatically different time to live. And our concept of uh, we right now believe in humans as the only living entities in the world, the universe, but that concept will be radically altered. And that's a big change to realize that no, there are other higher order beings, even cryptoterrestrials living under the Earth's surface. Even that would become evident. So we know that we are part of a larger cosmic or galactic family, and that's going to make a big difference in our outlook towards ourselves, our duty towards the planet, and our overall place in the cosmos, and how we should really think and function to maintain the harmony and balance, not only on our planet, but because whatever we do on Earth also has a bearing on the rest of the cosmos. So,
Hmm.
all of that new wisdom, new guidance, new teachings will be given once again to the survivors. And that is what the traditions say, that after Yuga ends, a new wave of wisdom and guidance comes in. So I think after 2040, there's going to be a dramatically different period. But till that time, we'll probably go through this narrow bottleneck when all of this Kali Yuga karma is going to come to a crescendo, and it's just going to lead to a lot of wars and upheavals.
Right.
And then the comet impacts as well.
So yeah, so you feel like there within the 2032, I think you said 2036 period, you're expecting a potential comet event.
Yeah, 2032 will probably be kind of a less intense event, just to make us aware that something is going on and we really need to change ourselves. And 2036 will probably be the defining moment for us.
Hmm. And
And I also think that the period from 2029 to 2036 could be the 7 year period of tribulation mentioned in the Revelation, because there's this asteroid called Apophis. It is going to come very close to the Earth in 2029 and once again in 2036. It's not going to strike us, but it's going to pass very close to the Earth on those two specific dates, which makes me think that it could be a signal that those two dates are very important from a prophetic point of view.
hmm. And you mentioned earlier when you talked about this e- Ecpyrosis period, you correlate it with flame, like the earlier one, the cataclysms was water, the deluge, and you talked about flame. So there's a kind of like a baptism by water, baptism by fire idea, but do you have any ideas about how the flame archetype or how that is obviously a rebirth, renewal, sort of phoenix-like metaphor there, but what are you thinking in terms of that?
It's well, actually, there's an Indian text which says that throughout the Young Address period, there was a swarm of 26 comets which struck us and brought about a lot of changes. And I think that swarm might come back again and strike us again over this entire period. And that might cause some of the fires. But the fire could be not only an external fire. We need the external fire because we've made a mess of the environment over the last 300 odd years. So that needs to be cleaned up, including so much nuclear waste, which we still don't know how to dispose of. So we need that cleanup. So that external cleanup will probably be done by comets, because comets are the main cleansing agents, and they just seem to do this periodically. And they also bring water, and they also bring new DNA molecules. So they also seed the earth with new life. They seed the earth with water, make it more fertile. So they also regenerate the planet, apart from just destroying it. So I think it will be a sequence of cometary events, and but the fire could also be a metaphor for the internal fire, because the internal fire also purifies us.
Hmm.
So the fire could also be a metaphor for new wisdom teachings coming in and purifying us from within.
Hmm.
Fire of knowledge, the fire of wisdom, or the fire of knowledge. So I think it's both. I think it's both the fire from the comets and the fire from the new wisdom teachings that will come into the planet.
Yeah, I agree. So my last question for you, obviously your work is one of scholarship and you're, investigating time cycles and matching them with themes of history. But I'm wondering, how has this process gotten you, as you've delved into the philosophy of it, how has it changed or evolved your worldview and also how is this deeper probing into like the history of philosophy and sort of the wisdom teachings of old, like how has this transformed your worldview? And then also, given your conclusions about this, like what are your thoughts on like how you live your life today in preparation of this period of great transformation that is coming?
Well, I mean, first of all, in order to do this work, I had to open up my mind to a number of different traditions. I couldn't work only on the basis of one fixed idea. So that obviously gave me a peek into so many different cultures and their traditional values. And when you're talking of the Yuga cycle, you're also talking a lot about philosophy because ultimately it is the decline of consciousness. So ultimately, you go into their understanding of how this devolution has taken place. So obviously, that learning helps me um, in kind of uh, giving me a set of principles. If you see a set of principles being or a set of teachings being spread across the world, that kind of increases its power.
Hmm.
So, yeah, these must be the really important ones because I find them in so many places. So it obviously helped me in my own evolution as a person. I've become much more open to other cultures, other traditions, and it has bolstered my own wisdom. And the other thing is that I've understood that it's basically the decline from soul consciousness to ego consciousness, which is the root of the problem, which means as a person, I need to move away from ego consciousness to self consciousness.
Hmm.
That's an idea that has been deeply embedded in me. So I try to
Hmm.
make sure that I'm cleaning up my consciousness on a regular basis by through my certain spiritual practices, whether it's meditation or yoga or reading books or doing some service, something or the other to make myself get away from the trappings of this ego consciousness. So
Hmm.
there's less reliance, less attachment to material things. I'm not so, bothered about money or power or fame or anything like that. I'm more interested in just manifesting my potential and just following my purpose. So
Hmm.
right now my purpose is to explore the ancient wisdom and to find its connection with our modern understandings. Because without that, no thesis is going to be acceptable anymore. You have to
Hmm.
show the linkage to the data.
Hmm.
And so that is my purpose right now to show that the ancient wisdom teachings are actually reflected in our modern understanding of either time cycles or history or the universe for that matter.
Hmm.
So I've become more of a person driven by my uh, sole purpose rather than be influenced by what others are doing, what my peer group is doing. That doesn't bother me anymore.
Hmm. And do you have any other uh, plans or ambitions to get started on a new project after this book has been finished? Do you want to continue being doing scholarship and writing?
Yeah, I'm already working on my next book, and I hope I can bring it out, maybe next year.
Okay, great. Can you give us a preview of it?
Yeah, that's about the cosmic knowledge. This one is about time cycle. The next one is about cosmic knowledge, about how all the ancient cultures they had a specific cosmovision, which seems pretty odd to us, with the world tree and the circular earth and stuff like that. And I'll try to show that this is actually based on a very advanced cosmic knowledge.
Great. All right, we'll come back on when that's out and we'll talk about that. Well, I really appreciate you
Sure.
joining me. It was a great conversation. I actually learned a lot and you've inspired me to maybe go back and modify a couple of the points when I talk about the 3100 BC date. I mean, I referenced that because it does align with certain things about we talked about like the motion of the economy from temple to state control, and that kind of sets the stage for a number of things. But I think that it makes sense for me to go and just connect that shift detach it from that 3100 BC period and then move it more towards a Bronze Age civilization trend because I'm kind of appreciating now, having talked to you more about it, how that it is somewhat of an arbitrary starting point that seems to have built up momentum, detached from any kind of solid basis, and I think it's an important innovation on your part to come to that conclusion and to set the record straight. So I think this is actually a really important book, and I think it's coming out at the right time, obviously, considering this whole Kali adventure that we've been on. And so it's interesting that this dating of it and the sort of rethinking of the Kali Yuga would be coming out at this critical point in its culmination phase. So yeah, it's important work that you've done. I'm glad I stumbled on your book and we had this conversation and it definitely came at the right time for me. So I really appreciate you.
Well, thanks, Alex, for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you, and you asked some really probing questions. And normally, I don't have podcasts. I did a lot of podcasts. I really don't have so many probing questions coming at me. So you obviously know a lot about these cycles yourself. So it was great for me to share whatever I have researched and written in the book. And maybe if you get a chance to read the book, it might become even more apparent that I mean, it might become more clear as to what I was trying to convey.
Yeah, I definitely am going to. But yeah, and keep in touch, and you're definitely welcome back when your new book comes out. And yeah, man, cheers. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex.
All right,
Yeah,
take
have a
care.
great day.
You too.
Yeah, bye.